What do we do with the moments in history that do not sit quietly in the past? The fragments that seem too precise, too imaginative, too far ahead of their age. They wait for us in museum drawers, in broken tablets, in weathered stone, in stories passed from one voice to another across centuries. And each time we uncover one, it asks the same uneasy question. Have we misunderstood the shape of human knowledge? We like to imagine progress as a straight road, a slow climb from darkness into light. First the simple tool, then the written word, then the engine, the microscope, the computer, the star chart. It is a comforting story because it gives time and order. It tells us that what came before us was smaller, dimmer, and less complete. But the deeper we look into the ancient world, the more that story begins to tremble. Again and again, old civilizations appear at the edge of that neat timeline, like figures standing in fog. They seem to know something they should not know. They measure the heavens with startling confidence. They cut stone with unnerving precision. They store information in ways we still struggle to decode. They treat the body, the earth, and the sky as if they are reading from pages that history has since torn out. This is not a journey into certainty, it is a journey into possibility. Some of what follows may be interpretation, some may be coincidence sharpened by hindsight, and some of it may be evidence that human memory is older, stranger, and less linear than we have allowed ourselves to believe. So let us begin there in the half-light between fact and wonder. Not to chase fantasy, but to listen more carefully to the past. Because sometimes what looks like mystery is simply knowledge that survived longer than the story built around it. What if the oldest map of the sky was not drawn on paper, but pressed into clay by hands that vanished 4,000 years ago? In the dust of ancient Mesopotamia, archaeologists found tablets small enough to hold in one palm, yet vast in their ambition. Their markings looked administrative at first, the kind of records a busy city might keep without fanfare. But over time, scholars began to recognize a different pattern inside those wedges and numbers. The tablets were not merely counting grain or taxes. They were measuring the heavens. The people of Sumer lived under a sky unspoiled by electric light, where the planets moved like wandering fires. They watched with patience that modern life rarely allows. Night after night, season after season, they compared motion to memory, repetition to surprise. Out of that devotion came a system of astonishing order, one that treated the cosmos not as chaos, but as something readable. What makes their legacy feel so haunting is not just that they tracked celestial cycles, but that they seemed to think in scales larger than any single lifetime. Their mathematics reached beyond the immediate and into recurrence. Their base 60 system, still hidden in our clocks and circles, suggests a mind trained to divide time and space with elegance. In that sense, every modern minute carries a faint echo of Sumer. And yet, what survives is incomplete. A few tablets, a few translations, a few stubborn questions. Did these astronomer priests simply observe with extraordinary discipline? Did they inherit fragments of older knowledge already ancient in their own day? Or does the mystery feel larger only because we underestimate what careful attention can achieve over generations? Perhaps that is the first lesson of the ancient world. Wonder does not always arrive with machinery. Sometimes it begins with watching, with standing still long enough to notice that the universe has rhythms, and believing those rhythms can be understood. If the first great code of the sky was written in clay, then maybe civilization began. Not when we learned to build, but when we learned to look up. It began with a machine no one expected to find at the bottom of the sea. In 1901, sponge divers working near the Greek island of Antikythera surfaced with bronze statues, pottery, and fragments of a shipwreck long buried in silence. Among the treasures was a corroded lump of metal so unremarkable it might have been discarded. But when researchers looked closer, they found gears inside it. Not decorative gears, not simple mechanical parts, but an intricate system of interlocking wheels designed to calculate motion in the heavens. The Antikythera mechanism has often been called the world's first analog computer, and even now the phrase feels almost too modern for its age. Built more than 2,000 years ago, it could track celestial cycles, predict eclipses, and model the wandering paths of sun and moon with startling precision. It was not just a tool. It was a miniature universe made of bronze. What gives the device its emotional weight is not only its sophistication, but its loneliness. No other machine quite like it has survived. It stands in history like a sentence from a lost book, suggesting a chapter of engineering we can barely reconstruct. Somewhere there were minds that imagined the sky as a system of ratios, teeth, and turning intervals. Somewhere there were hands skilled enough to cut those ideas into metal. And then, as so often happens, time broke the continuity, empires shifted, knowledge scattered, workshops fell quiet. The mechanism sank into the sea, carrying with it the memory of a world more technically ambitious than we once believed. So the deeper mystery may not be how such a device was built. It may be how easily entire traditions disappear. We think of progress as something that accumulates, but history is full of erasures. Libraries burn, teachers die, languages fade. Inventions are born, forgotten, and born again under different names. The mechanism from Antikythera reminds us that intelligence is not rare in human history. Survival is. And perhaps what we call mystery is sometimes just the shape left behind when brilliance loses its witnesses. How do you explain a battery in a place that had no electricity, no wires humming through walls, no modern language for current or charge? Near Baghdad, archaeologists uncovered a small object that looked almost ordinary: a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. Separate, these pieces meant little. Together, they suggested something unsettlingly familiar. When reconstructed and filled with an acidic liquid, such as vinegar or grape juice, the vessel could produce a small electrical charge. It became known, cautiously and controversially, as the Baghdad Battery. No one knows with certainty what it was for. That uncertainty matters. The ancient world rarely leaves us instruction manuals. We are left with fragments and analogies, and the temptation to project our own imagination onto both. Some researchers have proposed ritual use. Others have wondered whether it may have been used in metal plating, medicine, or some practice now lost to language. And some remain unconvinced that it was a battery at all. Yet even the debate reveals something larger. The object forces us to confront how narrow our assumptions can be. We often picture the ancient past as technologically simple, as though ingenuity itself had to wait for the modern era to be born. But people in every age experimented with materials, observed reactions, and worked by touch as much as theory. They did not need our vocabulary to notice that certain combinations produced unusual effects. There is something intimate about that possibility. An artisan leaning over a bench, a priest or healer testing a sensation, a craftsman discovering that metal behaves differently after some curious process he cannot fully name. Knowledge does not always arrive as formal science. Sometimes it enters human life through trial, habit, and careful repetition. So perhaps the jar from Baghdad is less a puzzle about electricity than a mirror held up to our own certainty. We want the past to be simple because it flatters the present. But history is rarely so obedient. Sometimes a small clay vessel can remind us that discovery has always belonged to human hands, even when the language to explain it comes much later. What if the mystery was not hidden in metal or clay, but in the body itself, in the quiet architecture of flesh and pain? Across the ancient world, from Egypt to the Mediterranean, people practice forms of medicine that still feel unexpectedly precise. Among the most enduring symbols is acupuncture, often associated with later Chinese tradition, yet part of a broader ancient intuition that the human body is not a machine of separate parts, but a landscape of connections. Pain in one place could speak for imbalance in another. A point on the skin might open relief deep inside the body. To modern ears, that idea can sound mystical, but mystery does not always mean error. Long before microscopes or imaging scans, healers studied patterns with the most direct instrument they had: attention. They watched how breath changed under fear, how grief altered posture, how touch could soothe or awaken, how certain pressures eased suffering in ways they could not fully explain. Their maps were not made of nerves and hormones, but of experience refined over generations. The same can be said of ancient surgical practices, herbal compounds, and methods of setting bones or treating wounds. Again and again, the record suggests a paradox. Their theories were sometimes symbolic, yet their observations could be deeply practical. Their explanations may sound foreign to us, but their results often command respect. Somewhere within ritual, philosophy, and trial and error, there was real knowledge at work. That is what makes ancient medicine so moving. It was never just about cure. It was about presence, one human being staying close enough to another to notice what changed, what hurt, what returned. In that sense, medicine began not in laboratories, but in relationship. And perhaps that is why these old practices still linger at the edges of modern life. Not because they answer everything, but because they remind us that healing has always involved more than mechanism. The body remains partly known, partly felt, partly mysterious. Even now, with all our instruments, we are still learning how deeply the human being resists being reduced to a diagram. It started with a block of stone that seemed too heavy for imagination alone. In the quarries and temple grounds of the ancient world, there are stones so immense, so precisely placed, that they continue to trouble our sense of what should have been possible. Walls at Baalbek, foundations in Egypt, fitted masonry in the Andes, different cultures, different continents, and yet the same uneasy question returns. How were these masses moved, lifted, and set with such confidence, sometimes without mortar, sometimes with joints so fine a blade can barely enter? The simplest answer is often the wisest. Human labor, organization, patience, and a knowledge of materials deeper than we tend to grant the past. Great monuments do not require magic. They require time, planning, leverage, and communities willing to work toward a vision larger than any single life. But even when we reject fantasy, the mystery does not disappear. It changes shape. It becomes a mystery of skill, discipline, and collective intelligence. Imagine the sound of it. Ropes tightening, wooden sledges dragging across damp earth, foremen calling out rhythms, stonecutters reading the grain of rock the way sailors read weather. The achievement was not only physical, it was social. To raise vast structures from raw earth required coordination on a scale that reveals something profound about ancient civilization. These were not scattered peoples improvising in darkness, but societies capable of long attention. And perhaps that is why these stones still move us. They make visible a form of knowledge that modern life often hides. Not the knowledge of screens or code, but of weight, friction, angle, and endurance. A civilization can understand the world through its hands as much as through its theories. So the true wonder may not be that ancient builders accomplished the improbable. It may be that we have grown so distant from manual intelligence that we mistake mastery for impossibility. When we stand before those silent blocks, we are not only looking at engineering. We are looking at memory carved into matter, asking whether progress has made us wiser or simply less familiar with what human effort once knew how to do. What if some of the most advanced knowledge in human history was written down, then almost deliberately abandoned to dust and fire? In ancient libraries and workshops, invention was never a single event. It was a conversation across generations. Scholars copied diagrams by oil lamp. Engineers tested water pressure, gears, pulleys, and valves. Mathematicians translated the world into ratios and forms. In places like Alexandria, knowledge was gathered not simply to preserve the past, but to push beyond it. The tragedy is that so much of that momentum survives only in fragments. We know, for example, that ancient inventors designed devices powered by steam, pressure, and motion. Hero of Alexandria described mechanisms that could open temple doors automatically, animate figures, and turn heated air into movement. These were not industrial machines in the modern sense, but they were unmistakably experimental. They showed that the principles of automation and mechanical force were already alive in human thought long before the modern age claimed them as its own. So why did these ideas not transform the world in the way later technologies did? The answer may have less to do with intelligence than with context. An invention does not change history by existing. It must find a place inside labor systems, economies, politics, materials, and daily need. A machine can be brilliant and still remain a curiosity if the surrounding world has no path for it to spread. Genius alone is not enough. It needs continuity. That may be one of history's quietest heartbreaks. Not every discovery arrives at the moment that can receive it. Some appear too early, like seeds falling on stone. Others survive only as whispers, proof that possibility once existed even if it never became inheritance. And so the ruins of ancient learning ask us to think differently about human progress. Maybe history is not a staircase, but a field of sparks. Some catching, some fading, some waiting centuries for the right conditions to burn again. If so, then every lost invention is more than a curiosity. It is a reminder of how much the future depends not only on what we discover, but on what we manage to keep alive. How do you read a message when the language itself has become a ruin? On the island of Crete, archaeologists uncovered clay tablets inscribed with a script now known as Linear A. The signs are orderly, deliberate, almost elegant in their repetition. They belong to the Minoan world, a civilization of palaces, trade routes, frescoes, and sea light. And yet, for all we know about the beauty of that culture, its written voice remains largely silent to us. That silence has a peculiar power. We can hold the tablets, catalog the symbols, compare patterns, count recurring synonyms, and still remain outside the meaning. We do not know exactly what was being recorded: tribute, ritual, commerce, memory, prayer. Each possibility changes the emotional texture of the civilization itself. Was this a language of administration, or devotion, or both? Was it practical, poetic, sacred? The symbols do not refuse us out of malice. They simply outlived their interpreters. There is something deeply human in that loss. Writing is meant to preserve thought against time, yet time is patient. It erodes context first, then sound, then certainty. A script can survive for millennia while the living breath that once animated it disappears completely. What remains is shape without voice, evidence without full access. The tablets become mirrors for our own desire to recover what has slipped beyond reach. And still, even without translation, they tell us something. They tell us that these people believed their world was worth recording, that they organized experience into signs and entrusted those signs to clay. They remind us that every civilization, however distant, once had an inner life too immediate to seem mysterious to itself. Perhaps that is why undeciphered writing affects us so strongly. It is not merely an academic puzzle. It is the sensation of standing at the threshold of another consciousness and finding the door still closed. Linear A does not simply ask to be solved. It asks whether understanding is ever complete, or whether part of wisdom is learning how to honor what remains just beyond our grasp. What if the ancient world did not simply observe nature, but learned to translate it into forms of permanence we are only beginning to understand again? In Roman concrete, there is a quiet kind of defiance. Harbors battered by salt water, walls weathered by centuries, domes still standing beneath shifting skies. These structures have endured not because time spared them, but because their builders understood something about materials that was both practical and profound. Their mixtures of lime, volcanic ash, and stone created a substance that did more than harden. In some environments, it seems to have grown stronger with age. Modern engineers have studied these formulas with increasing admiration. What once looked like a crude ancestor of modern cement now appears, in certain contexts, to be more resilient and more responsive to its environment. Tiny cracks could trigger chemical reactions that help seal the material rather than simply weaken it. It is a humbling discovery. The past was not always less sophisticated. Sometimes it was sophisticated in a different language. That difference matters. Ancient builders worked close to geology, climate, and place. Their knowledge was not abstracted from the world, but drawn from repeated contact with it. They knew which earth held, which ash transformed, which moisture ruined, and which moisture cured. What they produced was not merely a building material, it was a collaboration with landscape. And perhaps that is why Roman concrete feels so resonant now. It arrives in an age when modern construction often values speed over lifespan, convenience over endurance. We have built marvels, yes, but also structures designed with shorter horizons. The Roman example asks an uncomfortable question. How much have we gained and what have we forgotten in trading durability for efficiency? There is no need to romanticize the ancient world to feel the force of that question. Its achievements were real, but so were its limits. Still, when we study those old harbors and surviving domes, we are reminded that intelligence can take the form of patience. A civilization reveals itself not only by what it can raise quickly, but by what it hopes will remain after it is gone. It began with a star chart that may also have been a prayer. Across the ancient world, people built monuments that seemed to do more than occupy land. They align, they point, they open towards solstices, equinoxes, lunar standstills, and the slow procession of stars. In places as distant as Egypt, Mesoamerica, Britain, and the Andes, stone becomes a kind of listening device tuned to the sky. The effect is both scientific and spiritual, though those words may have meant less separation to the people who built them. Stand in such a place at dawn on the right day, and the architecture seems to awaken. A shaft of light enters a chamber. A shadow falls with deliberate precision. A distant horizon frames the rising sun as if the earth itself were keeping time. These moments are not accidents. They suggest observation repeated across generations, careful enough to transform landscape into calendar. What moves us is not just the technical achievement, but the worldview behind it. To build with celestial alignment in mind is to live inside a larger rhythm. It is to believe that the seasons, the heavens, and human life belong to one continuous pattern. Agriculture, ritual, memory, and governance all become linked to an order written above. The sky is not background, it is a companion text. Modern people often divide astronomy from meaning. We measure the cosmos with extraordinary accuracy, yet many of us rarely experience it as intimate. Ancient observatories remind us of another way of knowing, one in which precision and reverence are not opposites. To track the heavens was also to locate oneself within them, and perhaps that is why these structures still feel alive. They are not only relics of observation, they are monuments to orientation in the deepest sense. They ask where we stand, how we mark time, and whether knowledge becomes poorer when it loses its sense of belonging. In watching how the ancients followed the sky, we may discover that the real mystery is not how much they knew, but how fully they understood that wonder itself can be a form of intelligence. What if the deepest mystery of ancient invention is not what was built, but what vanished between one generation and the next? History often leaves us with the finished object and almost none of the process. A stone vessel polished to impossible smoothness, a metal artifact whose composition seems unusually refined, a monument aligned with the heavens, yet stripped of the voices that planned it. We inherit the result, but rarely the workshop. The missing steps create a space where doubt naturally grows, and in that space, two temptations appear. One is dismissal, to assume the ancients must have been simpler than their achievements suggest, and that anything difficult can be explained away by accident or exaggeration. The other is myth, to fill every gap with fantasies too certain to be tested. Neither response truly honors the past. One shrinks human capability. The other abandons human reality altogether. The more patient path is harder. It asks us to accept that remarkable skill can exist without leaving complete records. Knowledge can be practical, embodied, and communal rather than theoretical. A craft may survive through apprenticeship for centuries and then disappear in a single era of collapse, migration, conquest, or neglect. Once the chain is broken, the object remains, but the intelligence that produced it becomes strangely invisible. That invisibility may be one of the oldest human experiences. We see it in lost languages, extinct techniques, and interrupted traditions everywhere. What survives in museums is often the shell of a much larger living world. Gestures, corrections, habits of touch, ways of seeing that were never written down because they were once too ordinary to need explanation. So perhaps the mystery surrounding ancient inventions teaches a very modern lesson. Civilizations do not lose knowledge only when libraries burn. They lose it when continuity breaks. When no one remains to say, "This is how it is done, watch closely." In that sense, every artifact is more than evidence of ingenuity. It is also evidence of fragility. And maybe the most haunting question is not how ancient people knew so much, but how often human beings have stood on the edge of brilliance and failed to carry it forward. It started with the simplest of human acts, looking at a thing and refusing to believe it was ordinary. That may be the thread connecting every ancient invention that still unsettles us. A jar, a gear, a tablet, a wall, a formula, a map of stars. None of them were miracles in themselves. They were answers to questions someone cared enough to keep asking. How do we track the sky? How do we move weight? How do we preserve memory? How do we heal pain, measure time, endure the sea, or shape the world so that it lasts a little longer than we do? Seen this way, the ancient world feels less like a gallery of riddles and more like a record of concentrated attention. These people were not chasing mystery for its own sake. They were responding to necessity, beauty, fear, devotion, and curiosity, the same forces that still drive discovery now. Their tools were different. Their explanations were framed by different beliefs. But the impulse beneath them was recognizably human. And that recognition matters, because distance can become a kind of arrogance. We place the ancient world behind glass and call it primitive, as if time alone guarantees wisdom. But the artifacts tell a gentler, more unsettling truth. Human beings have long been capable of subtle thought, disciplined observation, and technical grace. The line between past and present is not as wide as we like to imagine. In some ways, it may be thinner than memory itself. Perhaps that is why these inventions continue to hold us. They are not just remnants of old intelligence. They are reminders that knowledge has never belonged entirely to one age. It rises, disperses, reappears. It changes form, loses names, survives in fragments, and waits for someone else to notice what still glows beneath the dust. So the mystery begins to shift. It is no longer only about what the ancients knew. It becomes a question about us. Are we capable of seeing their achievements clearly enough to feel humility? And if we are, what other forms of wisdom might we be overlooking now, simply because they do not fit the story we have told ourselves about progress? What if the true legacy of these ancient inventions is not certainty, but a more honest relationship with the unknown? By the time we reach the end of this journey through clay tablets, bronze gears, enduring stone, forgotten formulas, and unread scripts, one thing becomes clear. Mystery is not a flaw in history. It is part of its texture. The past does not return to us intact. It arrives weathered, partial, translated through accident and survival. And yet, even in fragments, it has the power to reshape the way we think about human intelligence. These inventions do not ask us to abandon reason. They ask us to use it with humility, to investigate without arrogance, to admit when evidence is incomplete, and still remain open to wonder. That balance may be harder than either skepticism or belief alone, but it is also more human. We are meaning-making creatures, always standing between what we can prove and what we can only sense at the edges of understanding. There is something deeply moving in that position. We study the ancients because we want facts, yes, but also because we are looking for kinship. We want to know whether those distant lives were as curious, as inventive, as restless as our own. The answer, again and again, appears to be yes. They looked at the same moon, the same horizon, the same problem of time slipping away, and they answered with tools, symbols, structures, and acts of imagination that still reach us now. Perhaps that is the quiet revelation behind every so-called unexplained invention. The past is not lesser, it is unfinished in our minds. Every rediscovered object is a conversation resumed after a very long silence. Not a final answer, but an invitation. And so we arrive at the threshold of the ending with a paradox. The more we learn about these ancient achievements, the less alone we seem in history. Across centuries, across collapse and forgetting, the human pattern remains recognizable: to observe, to build, to preserve, to wonder. Maybe that is the one invention time has never erased, the persistent hope that the world, however mysterious, can still be understood. In the end, these ancient inventions leave us with something more lasting than amazement. They leave us with perspective. We began with the assumption that history moves in a clean line, that knowledge accumulates neatly, and that the modern world stands at the obvious summit of understanding. But the deeper we traveled into forgotten mechanisms, resilient materials, undeciphered scripts, celestial monuments, and fragments of lost technique, the more fragile that assumption became. The story of human thought is not a straight ascent. It is a tide. It advances, recedes, leaves traces, and sometimes returns carrying things we thought were gone. That does not diminish the present. it deepens it. Our technologies are extraordinary, but so is the long chain of minds that made all technology possible. The ancient inventor, healer, builder, observer, and scribe were not waiting passively for modernity to arrive. They were already engaged in the same essential struggle: to wrest meaning from the world, to shape matter with intelligence, to preserve what mattered against time, and to pass something useful or beautiful to those who would come later. And perhaps that is why these stories continue to resonate, not because they prove the past was magical, but because they reveal it was intimate with effort, failure, patience, and imagination. The mystery inside them is not simply technical, it is human. How much can be learned? How much can be lost? How much survives in fragments, waiting for another age to recognize its value? So maybe the final question is not whether science can explain every ancient invention. In time, many mysteries may yield. New evidence will surface, old assumptions will shift, but even then, the deeper lesson will remain. Civilization is not only built by discovery, it is built by remembrance. What we inherit is always incomplete. What we preserve becomes the future's memory of us. And somewhere between the ruins behind us and the unknown ahead, we are asked to decide what kind of ancestors we intend to be.